to contemplate just some simple truths. The truth, for instance, about what has happened in the course of the last several decades in our government-dominated schools. How are we to preserve in the hearts and minds of our children an understanding of the meaning of that simple phrase, all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights? How is that phrase to be anything but gibberish, anything but a meaningless combination of syllables and sounds, when our children today go into schools where you cannot speak the name of the Creator in the hallways, where you cannot invoke the authority of the Creator in the classroom? We have created an educational system funded throughout the country by taxpayer dollars that systematically turns our children away from the truth that makes them free. And yet, we go on taking it for granted that they're going to say those words and they'll mean something. I don't know how we can assume this. I don't know especially how we can assume it when in those same schools we're not only leading our children to turn their backs on the existence and authority of God. We don't realize it, but we've actually substituted an ideology that is the exact opposite of the ideology of the Declaration, of the principles stated there. And I don't want to get deeply into controversial thises and that's, but these days in our science classes, you know, they teach evolution. It's all well and good as far as it goes, but what I often wonder about, though, is you look at the basic philosophy behind it, and it is taught, you've noticed probably, as ideology and dogma. It's not taught as science. The reason I always observe that to folks is because science questions itself. A matter of fact, there's not a scientific theory on the books that you're not allowed to question in light of the facts. And the reason we accept them is because every time you question some of them, the facts fall out the same way. And that's the way it's supposed to be. On the day it ceases to be that way, we'll discard the theories, or at least we'll condition them. There's only one so-called scientific theory that's not taught in that fashion. And it's the theory of evolution, which is taught in such a way you can't even raise the scientific questions about it in the schools. I've wondered about this merely from the point of view of whether or not that is in fact the right method to teach our children science, but it does show you that it's not about science, it's about ideology, it's about dogma. And what is the dogma? Well, go back, scratch the surface of the writings and so forth. The old phrase that was used to describe it at one level, which had its social implications, was survival of the fittest. And what that means is the strong survive, the weak get left behind, and more pity on them. Well, no, don't take any pity on them, because that's the way things are. I don't see anything that could be further from the principle that lies at the heart of what is supposed to be the American understanding of justice. Not that the strong dominate, the strong rule, that the powerful self-justify, that the weak can be stomped on and left behind. Not at all. But rather that every individual, whatever their condition, their station, their background, whatever their strength or their weakness, is entitled to respect in their dignity and rights, because those rights come not from human power, but from the power and choice of God. That's the American understanding. And today, all too often, in our schools, we are not only letting our children turn their backs on that understanding, hear not a word that confirms the truth of the Creator's existence or authority. We're also, just by the way, substituting for it an ideology that represents the exact opposite of that true principle of justice. And every time I think this through, I wonder, why do we think we can get away with this? Why do we go on happily believing that everything will continue as it is? The elections, the due process, all the things we take for granted will just keep chugging along. It's never been that way anywhere else. You look at any historical epoch you want to name, and when folks finally discarded the moral foundation of their civilization, that civilization collapsed. It did not survive for long. And we are systematically turning our backs on the moral foundations of freedom, and not either in the abstract. It's not just a question of, oh, Professor Key's up there again, talking in his abstract principles. Not at all. Because we have not just turned our back in principle. We have not just turned our backs in the classroom. We have not just been willing to abandon the truth in some words that we neglect. In the name of a profound lie, we have reached across the line of justice into what ought to be the safe haven of the womb and snuffed out the lives of tens of millions of innocent human beings. We have not been content. We have not been content, it seems, merely to back away from the truth in thought. We have transgressed it in practice. And I know it's not fashionable these days, but our country was founded and sustained over its life by people who understood the profound truth that the life we live and the history we are part of, it unfolds in the presence of a judge. And we can tempt his judgment for just so long, and then we suffer the consequences. It's what led Jefferson, when he looked upon the institution of slavery, to write in the notes on Virginia, I think it was, "I tremble for my country when I think that God is just, and that his justice will not sleep forever." The sad truth is, I think we live in a time today in America when there are all too many people who think that the justice of God will sleep forever. They don't want to look back either at Thomas Jefferson's wary prediction or at Lincoln's acknowledgement that his prediction was correct when in the second inaugural address he looked upon the terrible cost of the Civil War, and in asking the question, how long would it go on? He said, if it had to go on until every drop of blood drawn with the lash was requited by one drawn with the sword, then as was said 10,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Our greatest statesmen were not afraid to acknowledge the existence of God. They were not afraid to remind this nation that unless we live in the light of his precepts, we can incur the judgment that falls against our transgressions. And I don't know, I guess it's one of those things people often wonder, oh, what keeps you going? One of the things that keeps me going is that if what I just said is true, then I think we ought to try sometime to look seriously at the question of what we are storing up for ourselves now in America.